Who was that woman in room 312? The question drifted through the nurse's station one gray November morning, not with concern, but with simple uncertainty. Nobody seemed to know the answer. The monitors hummed softly beneath the fluorescent lights. Computer screens glowed with charts, schedules, and patient numbers. Nurses hurried past carrying clipboards and paper cups filled with cooling coffee. Doctors moved from room to room with practiced efficiency. The hospital never stopped moving. It breathed like a machine, steady and relentless. Yet at the very end of the fourth-floor hallway, behind a door that rarely opened, sat a woman who seemed to have disappeared from everyone's memory. Her name was Margaret Johnson. At least, it had been. Now, most people knew her only as the patient in room 312. The elderly black woman rested quietly beside a window overlooking downtown Chicago. Outside, cold rain traced silver lines down the glass. Cars crawled through the streets below. People rushed beneath umbrellas, chasing appointments, deadlines, and places to be. Inside the room, time seemed slower. The only sounds were the faint beeping of a heart monitor and the gentle hiss of oxygen flowing through a tube near her bed. Margaret watched the rain without speaking. Her hands rested on top of a faded blue blanket. Thin fingers folded neatly together as if she were waiting for someone. The truth was, she had been waiting for a very long time. 3 weeks earlier, she had arrived at St. Catherine Medical Center after a medical emergency left her weak and confused. Since then, no visitors had come. No flowers sat on her windowsill. No balloons floated beside her bed. No phone calls arrived asking how she was doing. Every day, staff members entered, checked her vitals, adjusted medications, and left again. They were polite, professional, busy, but few stayed longer than necessary. Most glanced at her wristband before speaking. Most looked at the chart before looking at her face. Over time, something subtle began to happen. Her room number became more familiar than her name. Room 312 needs medication. Room 312 is ready for labs. Room 312 needs another blanket. The words echoed through the halls day after day. Room 312. Room 312. Room 312. As if the room itself mattered more than the woman inside it. Margaret noticed. Of course she noticed. She remembered a different life, a different sound. There had been a time when people spoke her name constantly. Children had once raced toward her every morning. Parents had thanked her. Students had hugged her at graduation. For nearly 40 years, she had stood in front of classrooms filled with young faces and hopeful futures. Back then, hearing her name had been ordinary. Now it felt like a memory fading at the edges. Margaret shifted slightly in bed and glanced toward the hallway. Footsteps passed her door. Voices drifted by. Nobody stopped. Nobody entered. The afternoon light grew dimmer as storm clouds gathered over the city skyline. She lowered her eyes toward the plastic identification bracelet around her wrist. The black letters were beginning to fade. For a long moment, she simply stared at them. Then she whispered something so quietly that even the machines beside her could not hear it. I hope somebody still remembers who I am. The next morning arrived with a pale winter sun struggling to break through the clouds above Chicago. The light filtered through the hospital windows in thin ribbons of gold, stretching across polished floors and quiet hallways. Margaret Johnson woke before dawn, as she often did. Sleep had become lighter in recent years, interrupted by memories that arrived without warning and lingered long after the darkness faded. She opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling tiles above her bed. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then the soft beeping of the monitor beside her reminded her. St. Catherine Medical Center. Room 312. The same room. The same silence. She slowly turned her head toward the window. The rain had stopped overnight. Tiny droplets still clung to the glass, sparkling in the early light. Somewhere below, a delivery truck backed into a loading dock. The distant sound echoed upward. Margaret listened carefully. Listening had become a habit. When nobody came to talk, the world spoke in other ways. The hum of ventilation systems. The squeak of rolling carts. The muffled laughter of nurses changing shifts. These sounds filled the empty spaces where conversations used to be. Around 7 o'clock, a nurse entered carrying medication. She smiled politely while checking a chart attached to a tablet. "Good morning," she said. Margaret returned the smile. "Good morning." The nurse adjusted an intravenous line, confirmed a few numbers, and left within minutes. Efficient, kind, busy. The door closed again. Margaret looked toward it for several seconds after the nurse disappeared. She had hoped for another question. Any question. How are you feeling today? Did you sleep well? What was your favorite subject to teach? But the opportunity never came. By mid-morning, sunlight brightened the room. Margaret reached toward the bedside table and carefully opened a worn leather notebook. Its cover showed years of use. The edges were softened from countless hands and countless days. Inside were names. Hundreds of names. Former students. Some written in blue ink. Others in black. A few accompanied by tiny notes she had added decades ago. Loved science projects. Always shared her lunch. Needed encouragement, but never gave up. Margaret traced one name gently with her fingertip. Then another. Then another. Faces returned to her mind as clearly as if they had walked into the room. She remembered school assemblies, field trips, graduation ceremonies. She remembered children arriving nervous on the first day of class and leaving confident by the last. Sometimes she wondered where they were now. Doctors, teachers, mechanics, parents, grandparents. The world had carried them forward while she remained behind with memories. A faint smile appeared on her face, then slowly faded. The room suddenly felt larger than before. Larger and emptier. Around noon, voices drifted from the hallway. Someone nearby was receiving visitors. Margaret heard laughter followed by cheerful greetings. A child asked for ice cream. A woman laughed. Another voice promised they would bring flowers tomorrow. Margaret listened until the sounds disappeared. She closed the notebook and rested it against her chest. The weight was comforting. It reminded her that her life had mattered, that she had mattered. Yet a quiet fear remained. What happens when there is nobody left who remembers your name? The question settled heavily in her thoughts. Outside her door, hospital life continued at its usual pace. Staff members hurried past room 312 without noticing that inside sat a woman who had spent 4 decades shaping young lives. A woman who once knew every student by name. A woman who could still remember birthdays from 30 years ago. Margaret glanced once more toward the hallway. Then she folded her hands and waited, unaware that somewhere else in the building, a young nurse named Emily Carter was about to begin a shift that would change both of their lives forever. Emily Carter adjusted the badge clipped to her navy blue scrubs as the elevator climbed toward the 4th floor. It was only her 2nd month working at St. Catherine Medical Center, yet she had already learned something many people spent years discovering. Hospitals were filled with stories nobody had time to hear. Every room held a life. Every chart represented decades of memories, victories, regrets, friendships, and dreams. Yet most days, staff members only saw symptoms, medications, and schedules. Emily understood why. The pace was relentless. The demands never stopped. But a part of her still resisted becoming numb to it all. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Warm air carrying the scent of coffee and disinfectant greeted her as she stepped into the hallway. Nurses exchanged updates at the station. Phones rang. Computer keyboards clicked steadily. Another busy day had begun. Emily accepted her assignment sheet and scanned the list of patients under her care. Room 308. Room 311. Room 315. Then her eyes paused on room 312. The name attached to the chart was Margaret Johnson. Something about it felt familiar, though she could not explain why. She slipped the sheet into her pocket and began her rounds. Throughout the morning, she moved from room to room checking medications, answering questions, adjusting blankets, and reassuring anxious families. By noon, her feet already ached. Yet every time she returned to the nurse's station, her gaze seemed to drift back toward the final room at the end of the hallway. Room 312 sat alone in a quieter section of the floor where fewer visitors passed. The door remained closed most of the day. Around 1 o'clock, Emily finally pushed it open. Sunlight spilled across the floor from the large window overlooking the city. The room felt strangely peaceful compared to the noise outside. Margaret sat upright in bed, her leather notebook resting in her lap. She looked toward the door when Emily entered. Their eyes met briefly. Emily smiled. Margaret returned a small smile of her own. "Good afternoon," Emily said. "How are you feeling today?" "I have had worse days," Margaret replied softly. Her voice carried warmth despite the loneliness surrounding her. Emily stepped closer and reviewed the chart attached to the foot of the bed. As she checked vital signs, she noticed something unusual. The admission notes contained several pages of medical information, emergency contacts that no longer answered, insurance details, and treatment updates. Buried near the bottom of one page was a small line that many people would probably overlook. Preferred name, Margaret. Emily stared at the words for a moment. She glanced back toward the woman in the bed. Most charts included preferred names, but something about this note felt different. Perhaps it was because the handwriting looked older than the rest of the file. Perhaps it was because the request seemed almost forgotten beneath layers of paperwork. Margaret noticed her looking. "Did you find something interesting?" she asked gently. Emily blinked and smiled. "Just making sure I learn everything correctly." Margaret nodded. "That is always a good habit." Emily finished her work but did not rush toward the door. Instead, she noticed the notebook resting on Margaret's lap. The edges were worn smooth from years of use. "That looks important," she said. Margaret glanced down at it. A faint light appeared in her eyes. "It is," she replied. "It contains names I never wanted to forget." Emily felt something stir inside her. Outside the room, the hospital continued rushing forward. Inside, time seemed to slow. Neither woman realized it yet, but a simple observation made during an ordinary shift was quietly becoming the first step towards something extraordinary. The following afternoon, Emily found herself thinking about Margaret long before her shift brought her back to room 312. She could not explain why. Hospitals were full of patients who deserved attention, kindness, and care. Yet something about the elderly woman at the end of the hallway lingered in her thoughts. Perhaps it was the notebook filled with names. Perhaps it was the quiet dignity Margaret carried despite her loneliness. Or perhaps it was the way her eyes seemed to brighten whenever someone stayed an extra minute. Shortly after lunch, Emily pushed open the door again. Soft sunlight poured through the window, painting warm rectangles across the floor. Margaret was sitting in the same chair beside the bed, gazing outside at the city skyline. A freight train moved slowly across distant tracks, its silver cars catching flashes of light. "Good afternoon, Margaret," Emily said as she entered. The reaction was immediate. Margaret turned toward her. For a second, she simply stared. Then something changed in her expression. Her shoulders relaxed. Her eyes widened slightly. A gentle smile appeared. "Good afternoon," she replied. Emily began checking her chart, unaware of the emotion building inside the older woman. The room felt unusually quiet. Finally, Margaret spoke. "Would you mind saying that again?" Emily looked up. "Saying what?" Margaret lowered her eyes briefly before answering. "My name." Emily smiled softly. "Good afternoon, Margaret." The elderly woman closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, they shimmered with tears. Not tears of sadness. Something deeper. Something older. Emily immediately stepped closer. "Are you all right?" Margaret nodded slowly. "Yes, I think so." She pressed one hand against her chest. "I just cannot remember the last time someone said it." Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. Outside the room, carts rolled down the hallway. Phones rang at the nurse's station. The world continued moving. Inside room 312, time seemed to pause. Margaret looked toward the window again. "Do you know something funny?" she asked. Emily pulled a chair closer and sat down. "What is that?" Margaret smiled faintly. "I spent 40 years learning the names of children. Every September, I memorized a new classroom. 25 students. Sometimes 30. Every year." Her voice softened. "I believed names mattered." Emily listened carefully. Margaret continued. "A child changes when someone remembers who they are. They stand a little taller. They feel seen." Silence settled between them for a few seconds. The heart monitor maintained its steady rhythm. Then one day, Margaret said quietly, "You get older. Friends move away. Family members pass on. The phone rings less often. People become busy." She glanced down at her folded hands. "And eventually you wonder if your own name matters to anyone anymore." Emily did not know what to say. Some moments required solutions. Others required presence. This felt like the second kind. So she simply stayed. For nearly 20 minutes, Margaret shared stories from her years as a teacher. She described nervous first graders arriving on the first day of school. She recalled science fairs, spelling bees, Christmas concerts, and graduation ceremonies. As she spoke, her face seemed younger. The loneliness that usually filled the room loosened its grip. Laughter occasionally replaced silence. When Emily finally stood to leave, Margaret looked disappointed for only a moment. Then she smiled again. "Thank you for stopping by." Emily paused at the door. You are welcome, Margaret. Once more, the name filled the room. Margaret's eyes glistened. After Emily left, the elderly woman remained seated beside the window. The city stretched endlessly beyond the glass. For the first time in many weeks, the room felt a little less empty. And resting quietly inside her heart was something she had nearly lost. Not hope for a miracle, just the comforting feeling that somewhere in the building, one person still remembered who she was. That evening, after her shift ended, Emily sat alone in the employee lounge with a paper cup of coffee growing cold beside her. The room was nearly empty. A television mounted in the corner played muted local news while rain tapped softly against the windows. Most of the staff had already gone home. Yet Emily remained at the table, unable to stop thinking about Margaret. She remembered the way the elderly woman had closed her eyes when she heard her own name spoken aloud. She remembered the sadness hidden beneath her smile. Most of all, she remembered the notebook. Hundreds of names carefully preserved through decades of teaching. Emily opened her hospital tablet and searched through Margaret's file once more. The screen illuminated her face in the dim room. Basic information appeared. Age, medical history, emergency contacts, admission details. Then a line caught her attention. Occupation, elementary school teacher, retired. Emily leaned back slowly. 40 years. 40 years spent shaping young minds. 40 years spent encouraging children who probably now lived all across the country. Doctors, lawyers, nurses, business owners, parents, grandparents. Entire lives built partly upon lessons learned inside Margaret's classroom. Yet now she sat alone in room 312 with no visitors. The thought felt wrong somehow. Emily closed the file and stared out the rain-streaked window. The next morning she arrived early. Before beginning her rounds, she stopped at a small bakery near the hospital entrance. The smell of cinnamon and fresh bread filled the air as customers hurried through the doors. Emily purchased a blueberry muffin and a cup of tea. Nothing extravagant, just a simple breakfast. When she entered room 312 shortly after sunrise, Margaret looked surprised. Soft golden light spilled through the window behind her. The city was slowly waking beneath a blanket of low clouds. Emily set the tray on the bedside table. "I thought you might enjoy breakfast company," she said. For a moment Margaret simply stared. Then she laughed softly, the sound warm and genuine. "You know," she said, "it has been a very long time since anyone invited themselves to breakfast with me." Emily pulled up a chair. They ate together while the hospital buzzed beyond the closed door. Margaret spoke about her first teaching job in a small Chicago neighborhood school. She described decorating classrooms every August and staying late to help struggling students. She shared stories about science fairs built from cardboard and glue, spelling contests that felt like championship games, and children who arrived frightened but left believing in themselves. The more she talked, the more Emily realized something remarkable. Margaret remembered nearly every student she mentioned. Names, faces, dreams, tiny details preserved across decades. "How do you remember all of them?" Emily asked. Margaret smiled and looked down at her tea. "Because every child wanted the same thing." "What was that?" Emily asked. "To know they mattered." The answer settled quietly between them. Emily felt a chill despite the warmth of the room. She suddenly understood why hearing her own name had affected Margaret so deeply. For 40 years, she had given that gift to others. She had spent a lifetime making people feel seen. And somewhere along the way, nobody had done the same for her. Later that afternoon, after finishing her duties, Emily returned once more. Margaret had fallen asleep beside the window, her notebook resting on her lap. The late-day sunlight illuminated the worn leather cover. Carefully, Emily picked it up to keep it from sliding onto the floor. A folded piece of paper slipped from between the pages. She caught it before it fell. At first, she intended to place it back without looking. Then she noticed a handwritten title across the top. Former students. Beneath it were dozens of names followed by notes, schools, cities, and careers. It was not merely a memory book. It was a record of lives she had touched. Emily stared at the list for several seconds. Then a thought entered her mind so suddenly that it made her heart race. She looked at Margaret sleeping peacefully in the golden light. Outside the window, the sun dipped lower over Chicago. Inside room 312, the first spark of an idea began to grow. That night, long after most visitors had gone home and the hospital corridors had settled into their quieter rhythm, Emily sat alone at a workstation near the end of the fourth floor. The overhead lights cast a soft glow across the empty hallway. Somewhere in the distance, an elevator door opened and closed. A janitor guided a polishing machine across the lobby below. Beyond the windows, Chicago shimmered beneath thousands of lights scattered across the dark horizon. Emily opened the folded paper she had discovered inside Margaret's notebook. She read through the names again. Some had occupations written beside them. Others had cities. A few included brief notes written in careful handwriting. Future doctor. Loves helping others. Wants to become an engineer. Dreams of opening a bakery. Emily smiled as she imagined the young students those notes once described. Then she wondered where they were now. The thought refused to leave her. Around midnight, she typed a few names into an online search engine. She expected nothing. After all, decades had passed. People moved. Names changed. Lives unfolded in unpredictable directions. Yet within minutes, a familiar name from the list appeared. A pediatric surgeon practicing less than 20 miles away. Emily stared at the screen. Her pulse quickened. She searched another name. A school principal. Another. A city council member. Another. A business owner. The notebook was not a collection of forgotten memories. It was a map leading toward hundreds of lives that still existed. Hundreds of people who might remember the woman sitting alone in room 312. The next morning arrived bright and unusually clear after several days of rain. Sunlight streamed through the hospital windows, warming the floors and brightening the walls. Margaret sat near her window watching the city wake beneath a pale blue sky. She seemed calmer than usual. The previous day's conversations with Emily had left a quiet comfort lingering in the room. When Emily entered carrying a cup of tea, Margaret smiled immediately. "Good morning, Margaret," she said. Once again, the simple sound of her name brought warmth to the older woman's face. They spent nearly an hour talking. Margaret shared stories about classroom projects, school concerts, and children who struggled until someone believed in them. Emily listened carefully, asking questions whenever she could. At one point, Margaret laughed so hard she needed to wipe tears from her eyes. The sound filled the room with life. Yet beneath the laughter, Emily noticed something else. Every story ended with a student's name. Margaret remembered all of them. She remembered their fears, their talents, their dreams. It was as though every child she had ever taught still occupied a place inside her heart. Later that afternoon, after Margaret had fallen asleep for a short nap, Emily returned to the nurse's station and opened her laptop. She began drafting a message. She kept it simple. No dramatic language. No requests for sympathy. Just the truth. She wrote about a retired teacher named Margaret Johnson who had spent 4 decades helping children believe in themselves. She mentioned the notebook filled with names. She described how carefully Margaret remembered her students even now. Before posting it, Emily hesitated. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. Perhaps nobody would respond. Perhaps the message would disappear unnoticed among thousands of others. But then she remembered the look on Margaret's face when someone simply spoke her name. Emily pressed send. The message traveled into the world with a single click. Then she closed the laptop and returned to work. Across the city, people continued their routines without realizing that a small ripple had just entered the water. In room 312, Margaret slept peacefully beside the window as afternoon sunlight rested across her blanket. She had no idea that somewhere beyond the hospital walls, the first pieces of something extraordinary had already begun moving toward her. The first response arrived less than 2 hours after Emily posted the message. She almost missed it. The notification appeared quietly on her phone while she was updating patient records near the nurse's station. She opened it without much expectation. The message contained only a few sentences. "Margaret Johnson was my 3rd grade teacher in 1987. She changed my life. Is this really her?" Emily stared at the screen. A second notification appeared before she could answer. Then a third. Then a fourth. By the end of her shift, more than 30 messages had arrived. Some included photographs. Some shared memories. Others simply said thank you. The next morning, the number had climbed into the hundreds. Emily sat in stunned silence as she scrolled through them. One message came from a pediatric surgeon working in Chicago. Another came from a firefighter in Milwaukee. A woman in Seattle wrote that Margaret had helped her overcome a reading disability when she was 8 years old. A judge from Indianapolis shared that Margaret was the first person who ever told him he was capable of greatness. Every story carried the same theme. Someone had believed in them when they were young. Someone had taken the time to learn their name, encourage them, and remind them that they mattered. And that someone had been Margaret Johnson. The responses spread far beyond what Emily had imagined. Former students began sharing the message with classmates. Alumni groups reposted it. Teachers shared it with other educators. By Thursday afternoon, people from more than 20 states had reached out. Emily printed several of the messages and carried them to room 312. The late afternoon sun filled the room with a warm amber glow. Margaret sat beside the window with her notebook resting on her lap. She looked up when Emily entered. "You seem excited about something," Margaret said with a smile. Emily sat beside her and carefully placed the stack of printed pages on the blanket. "I have something I want you to see." Margaret adjusted her glasses and picked up the first page. As she began reading, her expression changed. Her eyes widened. Then she read another page. And another. A surgeon thanking her for staying after school. A mother remembering a handwritten note Margaret once slipped into a lunchbox. A business owner recalling how she encouraged him after he failed an important test. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she turned each page. "Oh my goodness," she whispered. "I remember him." A few moments later, tears rolled down her cheeks. She laughed softly through them. "I remember her too." Emily watched quietly as decades of memories came rushing back to life. Names that had once existed only inside Margaret's notebook were now speaking back to her. Real people, real lives, real gratitude. The room felt different somehow though it had become larger than its four walls. Margaret reached the final page and pressed it gently against her chest. For several seconds, she could not speak. Finally, she looked toward Emily. They remembered. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Emily nodded. They never forgot. Outside the room, the hospital continued its usual rhythm. Phones rang. Elevators moved between floors. Visitors came and went. Yet word about Margaret began spreading throughout the building as well. Nurses stopped by to read some of the messages. Doctors paused during rounds to hear a story or two. Staff members who had never entered room 312 suddenly found reasons to visit. By evening, a small bulletin board near the nurses' station displayed printed notes from former students. More arrived every hour. What had started as a simple act of kindness was becoming something much bigger. And for the first time since her arrival at St. Catherine Medical Center, Margaret no longer felt invisible. She sat beside the window as the sun disappeared beyond the Chicago skyline, holding a stack of letters from people she had once taught, while a feeling she had not experienced in years slowly returned to her heart. She belonged to someone. She always had. She had simply forgotten how many people carried a piece of her with them. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and crisp autumn air sweeping across Chicago. Sunlight poured through the windows of St. Catherine Medical Center, filling the hallways with a warm glow that seemed brighter than usual. Emily stepped off the elevator and immediately sensed something different. The lobby was busier than normal. Groups of visitors stood near the reception desk carrying flowers, greeting cards, and small gift bags. Some spoke quietly while checking directions on their phones. Others held printed copies of the message that had spread across the country. At first, hospital staff assumed it was a coincidence. Then the first visitor asked for room 312. A few minutes later, another asked for the same room. Then another. By 10 o'clock, the receptionist had answered the same question more than 20 times. Emily hurried upstairs and found several. Nurses gathered near the end of the fourth-floor hallway. They exchanged surprised smiles while watching the steady stream of visitors arrive. Inside the room, Margaret sat beside the window reading one of the letters she had received the night before. The knock on her door came softly. She looked up. A middle-aged man stood in the doorway holding a bouquet of yellow flowers. His silver-framed glasses rested low on his nose. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the man smiled. "Mrs. Johnson?" Margaret blinked. "Yes." The man laughed gently. "You probably do not remember me." Margaret tilted her head. Something about his face seemed familiar. The man stepped closer. "My name is Daniel Foster. 3rd grade. Lincoln Elementary. 1989. Margaret's eyes widened instantly. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Danny." The man nodded. Tears appeared in his eyes. "You used to stay after school and help me read because I was embarrassed to read out loud in class." Margaret stared at him in disbelief. You hated chapter books. Daniel laughed. And now I write them. The room filled with emotion. Before either could say another word, another knock sounded at the door. Then another. Then another. Within an hour, room 312 had become the most visited place in the hospital. Former students arrived from across Illinois. Some drove 3 hours. Others canceled weekend plans. One woman flew in from Minnesota after seeing the story online. Each person carried a memory. A teacher remembered a note of encouragement Margaret had written after a difficult family loss. A firefighter remembered her telling him that courage was not the absence of fear. A physician recalled a science project that inspired his medical career. One after another, they entered the room and thanked her. Margaret laughed. She cried. She listened. She remembered names she had not spoken in decades. The notebook that once felt like a collection of fading memories had suddenly become a living reunion. By afternoon, flowers lined the windowsill. Cards covered nearly every available surface. Hospital administrators stopped by to witness the extraordinary scene unfolding before them. Nurses who normally rushed through shifts found reasons to linger near the doorway. Even patients from neighboring rooms asked what was happening. The answer was simple. A teacher was discovering the true size of her legacy. As the afternoon sunlight stretched across the floor, Margaret sat surrounded by former students whose lives had been shaped by her kindness. For years she had believed she was forgotten. Yet every face entering the room revealed the same truth. The lessons she gave away had never disappeared. They had simply continued traveling through the lives of the people she helped, waiting for the day they could return home to her. By Sunday evening, the fourth floor felt almost unrecognizable. What had once been a quiet hallway had become a place filled with smiles, conversations, and gratitude. The steady stream of visitors continued throughout the day. Some stayed for only a few minutes. Others remained for hours, sharing stories that stretched across decades. Margaret listened to every one of them. Sometimes she laughed until tears formed in her eyes. Sometimes she simply held a person's hand while memories bridged the distance between past and present. As the sun began its slow descent over Chicago, the final visitors of the day gradually said their goodbyes. One by one, they promised to return. Some left phone numbers. Others left photographs. A few left handwritten letters folded carefully beside the growing collection on her table. When the room finally grew quiet again, it no longer felt empty. Flowers filled the windowsill. Cards covered nearly every available surface. Framed photographs leaned against books and medical equipment. The room carried the warmth of human connection. Emily entered just as the sky outside turned shades of orange and gold. She paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. Margaret sat beside the window holding a photograph someone had given her earlier that afternoon. It showed a classroom from nearly 30 years ago. Rows of smiling children stared back at the camera. Margaret's younger self stood in the center, proud and hopeful. Emily walked over and sat beside her. Neither spoke for a moment. The city skyline glowed in the fading light beyond the glass. Finally, Margaret smiled. I used to wonder if any of them remembered me. Emily looked around the room. I think you have your answer. Margaret laughed softly. I suppose I do. Her eyes drifted toward the dozens of cards surrounding her. You know what surprises me the most? Emily shook her head. Margaret held the photograph closer. Not one of them talked about grades. Not one of them mentioned test scores. She smiled thoughtfully. They remembered how I made them feel. The words settled gently into the quiet room. Outside, the first evening lights appeared across the city. Cars moved like tiny streams of gold beneath the darkening sky. Emily glanced toward the notebook resting on the bedside table. For years it had been a record of names Margaret refused to forget. Now it sat beside hundreds of reminders that those names had never forgotten her either. A comfortable silence followed. The monitor hummed softly nearby. Somewhere down the hallway, a nurse laughed at a joke. The hospital continued its rhythm, but room 312 felt different now. It felt alive. Margaret turned toward Emily. Her eyes were bright, peaceful, and full of gratitude. Thank you, she said quietly. Emily smiled. For what? Margaret looked around the room once more. For seeing me. Emily felt emotion rise in her chest. She reached over and gently squeezed Margaret's hand. Neither woman needed to say anything else. The evening light continued fading until the room was bathed in the soft glow of bedside lamps. Margaret settled comfortably into her chair by the window. Beyond the glass, Chicago shimmered beneath a blanket of stars. Beside her sat letters from former students, photographs from forgotten years, and enough memories to fill a lifetime. For weeks, she had feared becoming invisible. She had worried that time had erased her place in the world. But now she understood something beautiful. Kindness never truly disappears. It travels quietly through the lives it touches. Sometimes it takes years, sometimes decades, but eventually it finds its way back home. As night settled over the city, Margaret closed her eyes and smiled. Not because she was remembered by hundreds of people, not because her room was full of flowers or cards, but because she finally knew the truth. Her life had mattered. And in the peaceful silence that followed, the name on the door of room 312 no longer belonged to a forgotten patient. It belonged to a teacher whose kindness had changed generations, and whose story would continue long after the lights of the hospital dimmed for the night.